So now we'll move on to the first keynote of the day, which I'm very pleased to introduce. The title of the keynote is Mother of Invention, Why Including Women is the Missing Key to Innovation. And our speaker is Katrine Marçal. She is a writer. She's a journalist and correspondent for the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter. She's written two books. The first had a Swedish title to begin with. I'll say the English title, which is Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? Stimulating title, published in 2012. And then in 2021, The Mother of Invention, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built by Men, or for men, I should say. And I actually started reading the book this morning, Katrine. I didn't want to get off the tram and stop reading it. It was so stimulating and fun. So I look forward to continuing it later on today. And welcome to SIP Forum. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that introduction. So yes, I'm here to talk to you about my book, Mother of Invention. This is the US edition you can see here. I think the one you were holding in the studio is the UK one. The book came out in Sweden last year. It just was published in North America 2 months ago and in the UK this summer, and it will come out in more languages next year. And my background, as mentioned, is as a journalist, somebody who writes about economics and finance, I guess, mainly. And a few years ago, I wrote this other book called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, which has been published in more than 20 languages. But I'm here to talk to you about women and innovation, which is the theme of my new book. And the argument that I want to make this morning is that, one, women are excluded from innovation, and two, things we perceive as feminine are also excluded and devalued. And this is actually an economic problem. This holds innovation back. So I want to start by talking about maybe, the most classic example of a big innovation, at least in the narrative that many of us hold. So which is the invention of the wheel 5,000 years ago. Probably looked nothing like this, but clearly it was a big thing. And the technology of the wheel is something that we have then applied to many other problems and which has created many other innovations. We have put wheels on chariots. We have had bikes since the early 1800s, cars since the late 1800s. We have things like Ferris wheels. And our friend the hamster has even enjoyed the technology of the wheel through the hamster wheel, which was invented in the 1950s. And basically, in so many instances, when we've had to move something heavy from point A to point B, this has been made easier using the technology of the wheel. There is, however, one quite famous exception to this rule, which economists often talk about. And that's this one, suitcases. Wheels on suitcases were not invented until 1972. So that's 3 years after we managed to put 2 men on the moon, and the same year as we drove this thing with wheels on the surface of the moon. And this is often brought up because it just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. We've had suitcases, the modern suitcase, we've had some form of mass travel, at least since the late 1800s. The wheel, as mentioned, had been around for around 5,000 years by then. We've had, things with wheels that we were putting suitcases on, all these types of trolleys. Even something like the baggage carousel, at airports was actually invented before the rolling suitcase. And all of this has become a little bit of a classic mystery of innovation. So we have Nobel Prize winners in economics like Robert Shiller, have discussed this. Big thinkers like Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about it. And it comes up again and again in management literature on innovation. And this curious case of the very late invention of the rolling suitcase, it's often used as almost a cautionary tale. we think we are so good at inventing. We think we have progressed so much, but actually sometimes we tend to overlook these really straightforward, simple solutions. And we focus on what's technically challenging and complex, like putting 2 men on the moon. But these very simple solutions like, let's put wheels on suitcases can actually stare us in the face for decades before somebody, comes up with it and patents the invention. And that's how this story is usually told. And that is, I argue, in the book, the wrong way of telling it, because there is actually an explanation to this mystery. It is not a mystery. But to solve it and to see it, you need to have this key. You need to realize that the missing key to this, to explain this, is actually gender. Because if you do a bit of research, you quite quickly stumble upon things like this. So products very clearly applying the technology of the wheel to the suitcase well before 1972 and well before sort of the 1980s, when this product really, became a success. These products were around, but what they had in common was that they were almost all niche products for women, because there was this idea that no man would ever roll a suitcase. Even after the official invention of the suitcase with wheels in 1972, no American department store first wanted to sell it. And Bernard Sadov, who is the official inventor of the rolling suitcase, he said that, at this time, there was this macho feeling. Men used to carry luggage for their wives. It was like the natural thing to do, I guess. There was an assumption no man would ever roll a suitcase. Wheels on suitcases are ridiculous. Masculinity is something that always needs to be proven. It can never just exist. And a real man has to prove that he's a real man by dragging suitcases physically. Women, yes, they might want this product, but they're not a big enough market. If a woman travels, she travels with a man normally, who will then carry her suitcase for her. That was the assumption. And suitcases really didn't begin to roll until we changed these two things. We changed our perspective on gender, that men must carry in order to prove that they're real men, and that women's mobility must be limited. And here you can see it's like a typical advertisement for a rolling suitcase, sort of very clearly in the beginning marketed towards an idea of a new type of 1970s corduroy suited female businesswoman. And they were the first ones using this product, and then eventually the men followed. And today, of course, we don't seem threatened by a set of 3-centimeter wheels. But the thing is, only a few decades ago, this was a huge thing that actually held back the development of this product that we now take for granted, and that then went on to completely disrupt the whole global luggage industry, change how we travel, how we build airports and airplanes. And to me, obviously, as somebody who writes about women and innovation, it's interesting and funny that the answer to perhaps the most classic mystery of innovation, why didn't we put wheels on suitcases until 1972, actually is gender. And of course, something to keep at the back of our minds here is, would this product have been developed earlier if there had been more women or better diversity within the global luggage industry? That is worth thinking about. And the other point I want to make here is that I think in general, we don't think about gender as something that can hold back these sort of hard forces of innovation and technology. We don't tend to think of that the soft, like an idea about men and women, can hold back the hard sort of technological progress. We tend to see innovation and technological development as almost this neutral force pushing all of us in front of itself and the economy. But the thing is, of course, you know, we are the ones inventing the machines, funding the machines, demanding the machines and the products. And we come into all of these activities very, very shaped by things like, you know, our ideas about gender, which is why they also do shape innovation and technology in pretty profound ways. So let me give you another example from the book, which is this product. So this is the T Ford, which was created by Henry Ford in 1909, and is often talked about as the car that put the world on wheels. So it was his revolutionary idea to create an automobile that would be inexpensive enough for the workers who assembled it in the factory to actually eventually buy for their families. And it's credited with being the product that sort of turned the car from a luxury product for the rich into something that was on, you know, most drives in big parts of the world. And what's interesting from, you know, my perspective, which is gender and innovation, is that the same year that Henry Ford launched this product, the T Ford, the car for everyone, his own wife, Clara Ford, went out and bought a completely different car for herself. She didn't buy a T Ford, she went and bought this car for herself. And the difference between this automobile and the T Ford is that Clara Ford's car here is an electric. This is a Detroit electric. It's a very beautiful electric car. If some of you can see, it actually has an inbuilt crystal vase for flowers. And of course, even though it's not something that's present enough, I'd say, in the current, you know, discussion around electric vehicles, electric car technology is, as I think most of you know, pretty old. So electric cars were around at the dawn of the automobile era. So here we have the New York Times in 1910 going on about that, you know, now it is possible for an owner of an electric to install his own charging plant in his stable. And you can see the electric cars charging here. What's interesting to me is, you know, not just that, you know, here in London, I live outside of London, you could phone up an electric cab company in the 1800s and they would come and it would all work. But what's also interesting to me is how electric cars in this period pretty quickly started to be marketed to women. You can see a typical sort of advertisement here. Because pretty soon this idea emerged that this was a wealthy woman's car. Electric cars were slower, not at first, but, you know, eventually. They were much more comfortable. They were safer. They were reliable. They were, you know, very, very useful in sort of urban areas. That you could start them without having to actually leave the car and go out and crank it, something that became very dangerous as the engines got bigger. It was silent, it was clean. And all of these things, something that was slower, comfortable, safe, reliable, silent, and clean, made the electric car, in many people's eyes, into something that was feminine. And at first it worked. You know, the electric car companies sold a lot of vehicles to women. But what eventually happened, and actually pretty soon, was that this association between femininity and electric car technology, became a commercial problem for the electric car industry. So here we have them in 1916 in the US complaining about that the gasoline car dealers have branded the electric as a car for the aged and infirm and for the women. So in a sense, what happened was that because this got seen as a lady's vehicle, male consumers didn't want it, because there is this idea, particularly I'd say when it comes to technology, that if something is for women, it must be also technologically inferior. And that was certainly something that happened to the electric car of that period. And of course, it's interesting that today electric cars, they look more like this. Here you have, Mr. Elon Musk and that Tesla Cybertruck, which certainly does not have any inbuilt crystal vases for flowers. Today, more men than women drive electric cars. And it's interesting that the same form of technology can be sort of branded and marketed into like this completely differently gendered ways. And I must emphasize that, the fact that electric cars were branded as female was not the main reason to them then disappearing and us building a whole world for petrol-driven technology. There were other factors that were sort of more important, particularly around the limits of battery technology. There were a couple of big investments into electric car ventures and electric car infrastructure that didn't turn out well, which sort of made sort of the appetite to invest in this, less appetite to invest in these things. And these things were probably more important. But automobile historians, they do talk about that, another explanation to why, we chose to go with petrol-driven technology 120 years ago was also what they call other cultural factors. And what I argue in the book, Mother of Invention, is that you should probably call these other cultural factors for what they really are, which is sexism. This idea that things perceived as feminine are also considered inferior. And another, I think, important point is that it's not just that things branded as feminine are considered inferior. If wheels on suitcases is for women, it can't be for men as well. If electric cars are marketed as drawing rooms on wheels for wealthy women, we are unable to see their technological potential. It's also that things branded as feminine are often not even considered to be technology at all. Because there is this within the narrative of technology or the narrative of innovation. If you look back at the history of it, it does look like most important things ever have been invented by men. And that is a way of telling that story, of describing our history of innovation and how we got to where we are, that does have, I'd say, profound economic consequences today. Because obviously when women are studying the history of innovation or the history of technology, we are basically studying our own absence. And that's something that doesn't exactly encourage you to see yourself as an inventor or somebody with the potential to create technology. And then we see those things reflected in the economy. We know that men, for example, have almost a monopoly on venture capital. In Sweden, men get 99% of all venture capital. You all know how it looks when it comes to patents. And, this is a problem, and it becomes a quite a big economic problem, because, you know, we can't afford to basically innovate with, you know, at least only using a small part of our human potential. And that's what we're doing, because women are still not as present here as they should be and ought to be. And so why do we tell the history of innovation like this, and how can we change this narrative? So I think a lot of it has to do with this, that things invented by women or perceived to be feminine for different and often quite random reasons, we don't see as technology. So let me give you another example from the book, so which is this one. So when we were going to go to the moon, there was a technological problem. There were lots of technological problems that needed to be solved, but one of them was, you know, okay, humans are going to the moon, what should we wear? And there were lots of ideas. Here are some of them. And all of these are sort of quite traditional concepts in the way that, you know, the idea is that space is very dangerous for the human body. Therefore, we should put the human body in something that's hard, made from hard materials, to protect it from the deadliness of space. And none of these types of solutions ended up working. And in the end, what happened was that the contract to create these spacesuits, the suits that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin wore on the moon, went to a bra making company, because this company had technological expertise when it came to soft materials. And their proposed suit was soft and hand sewn by female seamstresses, as you can see here in the picture, which were, of course, extremely technically advanced. And they were moved straight from the production, in many cases, of female underwear into spacesuit production. And they created these suits. And this led to a lot of cultural clashes, obviously, with NASA, because they were sending two people to the moon. They wanted to know that these suits were safe. And they wanted this explained to them, the safety of the suit explained to them in a language that they understood, which was technical drawings, you know, traditional engineering. But the thing is, the people who could actually solve this problem, these seamstresses, they didn't speak that particular technological language. They came from a different world of technology and innovation, which, you know, of course, sewing and, you know, invention using soft materials is also technology. But the thing is, we don't see it as technical, largely because it's something that has been traditionally associated with women. And in the end, this is a happy story. But the way these things were solved was that the company in the end had to hire a special team of basically male engineers whose only job was to translate what the seamstresses were doing into technical drawings that were then never used in the actual production process, but they were just there in order to sort of calm NASA down. And it worked. And it's interesting to me that, you know, the image that most of us have, I think, of the moon landing is not the rocket. It is this type of image of these soft moon suits against this hard gray landscape of the moon. So bras actually took us to the moon. And the point I try to make by telling this as one of many stories in the book is that technology associated with women still doesn't count as technology in the same way. And this is what creates this narrative of, everything of any economic importance has been invented by men. And it matters. I mean, in school, we all learn it's called the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. But is that really how it should be? Could we tell this story differently? I mean, instead of the Stone Age, we could talk about the String Age. So string is an invention of that period that they think was done by women. We're not sure. This was a long time ago. Why isn't it called the String Age? Because you could argue that string is maybe just as important, or perhaps even more important, than the sort of stone tools that we think of when we hear the Stone Age, that were probably invented by men. But you could argue that string and rope is a more fundamental invention. Using string, you can suddenly tie things together, you can carry things in a different way, you can create fishing nets. We could talk about the String Age. And my point is that if we did, women would be included in this grand narrative of innovation in a way that currently they're not. In the same way, we don't talk about the Pottery Age, but of course, ceramics and all the inventions around that are also technologies and innovations. And a lot of that has historically been done by women, but we don't see it as, technology in the same way. Because again, inventions done by women are sort of excluded from this big story of innovation. Same thing again, the Flax Age. Everything, all of the technologies and inventions around weaving and cloth, something that women, specialized in economically for about 20,000 years or something. We don't call a whole sort of age the Flax Age or the Cloth Age or anything like that. And again, that makes us not think of this as technology or as something that's as important as things made out of stone, bronze, iron, etc. And this is sort of the big point I tried to make in the book, in a journalistic way, by telling these hopefully enlightening and interesting stories about innovation. And that is that our definition of technology has almost always followed our definition of masculinity. And that's the thing that creates this history of innovation where women are just not present. My mother, for example, was a computer programmer, and she went and became a computer programmer in the early 1980s, just after she had me. And this was in Sweden. And at the time, computer programming was still quite female dominated. The first computer programmers had been women here in the UK, where I now live, during the Second World War. Women basically invented software, which was considered to be sort of less technical than hardware, and therefore sort of left to the women. The way computer programming was discussed in sort of the early years was, as something that wasn't very technical. If you're good at following instructions, if you can cook from a recipe, you can become a computer programmer. And many women responded to that and went into this industry. And then, of course, it all changed. It became tech, it became hyper masculine. And when my mother retired, it was a completely different industry. And this is again the point, when women were programming computers, it wasn't considered to be technology. When women were inventing software, it wasn't really seen like like something of technical importance in that way. And we have that story again and again and again, which, you know, leads to this exclusion of women from innovation. And so what I argue in the book is, you know, how important it is to change this, to sort of add women back into the history of innovation in order to correct this, or help correct this economic problem that we clearly have today, where innovation is so still, unfortunately, still so male dominated, and we're missing out on all of these potentially great ideas and products and solutions, just because, again, pretty random ideas about men and women and masculinity and femininity. It's quite easy for us today to, you know, hear the story of the late invention of the rolling suitcase and kind of laugh about it. Oh, wasn't that silly? Why couldn't we see the potential of that idea? Why were we so blinded by this random idea about gender, that men had to carry a suitcase and women shouldn't travel alone? It looks stupid to us now. And in the same way today, when we're doing everything to sort of scale electric car technology, because, you know, we have to sort of rebuild the world. It can't just be a world for petrol driven cars anymore. The fact that electric vehicles were dismissed as ladies' vehicles, drawing rooms on wheels 120 years ago, that sounds silly to us. And it's easy to see these mistakes in retrospect. But the thing is, and what's really worrying is that, you know, I think we're still doing them. And I think the numbers and the statistics around lack of diversity when it comes to many innovation measurements is, you know, clear evidence to this and everything we're missing out on. And there's a lot to do in this field, obviously, but what I try to do in the book is try, you know, do my bit in order to try to shift the narrative a little bit. And I think it's important, you know, because adding women back into the history of innovation actually changes the whole story of technology. And I think that's particularly true coming at it from the perspective of economics. I think maybe particularly in economics, but also in popular culture in a way, there is this idea about, you know, how innovation started, that we were walking around way back on all fours, being hairy apes in one form or the other. We got up, or somebody got up, probably a man, grabbed some kind of big stick, sharpened it into a spear. And that was the first innovation, the first tool, the first form of technology. And everything since is basically an extension of this. That is still, I'd argue, how we tell the, you know, the beginning of innovation. This is sort of the founding myth of it. And of course, it's just a story. We have no idea what the first tool was, or what the first innovation was, or how it happened. You know, maybe we will know in the future, but today it's just a fairy tale. And what's interesting is how much we believe in this, how this has become, you know, a narrative of innovation. And we could tell this story in a completely different way, because what does this story do? It connects. If the first tool was inevitably a spear, some kind of hunting weapon, something sharp, everything since is basically an extension of that. What that does is that it, in our minds, ties, you know, the human will to innovate, to create technology, to some kind of inbuilt will to conquer and dominate the world around us, right? And you have that a lot in economics, ideas about how, innovation is a byproduct of war and conflict, and those things are really not true either if you look at them a little bit. And I talk about that more in the book, but it's interesting that we believe in them. And even today, we talk about innovation in this way. Innovation is about crushing, disrupting, move fast and break things. It's very much this narrative that, creating technology, innovating, the will to innovate comes from, this is the driving force: conquer, disrupt, crush, dominate the world around you. And obviously, in the last 5-6 years, there's been a big sort of public discussion around the problems of this, particularly around a lot of, tech innovation and what that has led to and what it has cost us. And what I argue in the book is that, if you want to shift this narrative, you need to add women back into the history of innovation. And not just women, but all of the things that for different and very often random reasons have been considered to be feminine and therefore not as technology. So you could say, okay, just as likely as the first tool was some kind of hunting weapon invented by a man, it could have been a digging stick, which is, a tool thought to have been invented by women. And just imagine this image with the man with the spear exchanged for a female inventor inventing a digging stick. It doesn't just bring women back into the narrative, it changes the whole content of it. If the first tool was a digging stick, which is something you use to dig out edible insects and roots from the ground, then our human will to create technology is not in the same inevitable way tied to some kind of will to crush and dominate. And the whole kind of paradigm of innovation, even in economic senses, can actually shift in the way that it needs to shift, particularly given the huge, climate change, climate emergency, the climate change problem we have to fix in the last couple of decades. Innovation can actually then move from something that just disrupts, crushes, and dominates to something that can also repair, tend, and cooperate. And it creates a completely different narrative. And that's why it's so important, I believe, to rewrite these stories. And that's why I wanted to create this book, that adding women back in to the story of innovation and technology, it helps women today imagine a different identity for themselves, which they need in order to go out with their ideas in a way that they're unfortunately right now not doing. And also it changes what innovation is and means, and it shifts technology, in our view of technology, into something that I believe is much more useful and hopeful at the stage that we're at. And that's what I'm trying to do in my way in this book called Mother of Invention, which is my way of trying to tell these stories, coming at it as a journalist, as somebody who writes about economics, and somebody that also really believes that these issues, diversity when it comes to innovation, are of such tremendous importance, and particularly right now. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there if there are any questions or comments or anything else. We have a few minutes, I believe. So there's a raised hand from Roberta.
Yes.
Yes, hi.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi, yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. It has been really fantastic to hear. I would like to ask, where can I buy your book?
Okay, yeah, what country you're in?
In Norway.
In Norway, yes. Okay, so the Norwegian translation is coming. It's not yet out.
No, I want to read it in English. It doesn't matter.
You want to read in English? Yes, so you can get it on, you know, in most places. You can probably the easiest is to get the UK version, and it should be available to order through Norwegian book retailers. It's called Mother of Invention.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's congratulations, a very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Roberta. There's a comment in the Q&A box from Stephen about that surely stone, bronze, and iron all follow the materials that can be used militarily. Flax, string, and pottery, not so well. String, right? Bow and arrow. I don't know. I'm not going to go into a big discussion on military history. Modern military and conflict technique based increasingly on software and programming still seem to be driven by male hackers. True. Games, players, and so on. Will this continue to be gender dominated? Yeah, I mean, I do think that software and programming is so interesting because it was just a few decades ago when that was actually female dominated. Software was invented by women. For the book, I interviewed fascinating sort of female computer pioneers, telling me about the shift in the 60s, here in the UK. It was even a point when sort of most of the people that knew how to program computers were women. The state then realized this could become a problem because computers are becoming increasingly important. We need men who can, go on and become sort of head of computing at the Bank of England and these big institutions. Where are we going to recruit these men for? And there was actually a state-funded program in the UK to attract men to computing. So completely different from today. And I think it's just such an interesting example of how, technology is, and gender and all of these things are connected in very interesting ways. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. What can we do to encourage more women into engineering at university? Yes, huge problem. Huge problem. I think there's a lot to do. I mean, because I wrote a whole book about, the need to change the narrative around innovation and rewrite economic history when it comes to this, I would, probably emphasize these things. But there are obviously other things to do as well.
Thank you, Katrine, also from me. I also have a final question, linking back also to our business and the Volvo Group. Do you think that a trigger would be to make sure that we have mixed teams of engineers around certain topics? And
yes.
Have you maybe also any reflections about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the research is pretty clear on that, and it's also like, I mean, it's intuitive to most of us, isn't it? Like, new ideas emerge when different perspectives meet. So that's why, the evidence is very clear that, diversity does lead to sort of better innovation outcomes. It also leads to more conflict and friction, and, like the story of the moon suits, is showing, but it does certainly lead to innovation. So I think it's clearly something that needs to be done. And there's also fascinating research around, how leaders who make sure that women are heard equally in meetings, create much better innovation outcomes in that group. So there's some, even like these really sort of micro shifts that can be done that can actually really, really help when it comes to this.
Very good tips to have in mind then. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to read your book during the upcoming holidays. That will be great.
Thank you.
So then, thank you for your contributions today.